Hey everybody, tonight we're debating communism and we're starting right now. With Infrared's opening statement, thanks so much for being with us, Infrared. The floor is all yours.
Sure. Glad to be here. Thank you. So, I think when we have a discussion about the over putting a overall historical verdict on judging the legacy of communism, I do agree that when we're talking about communism, we do have to talk about what that actually meant in reality. So this idea that communism has never been tried, or it wasn't true communism, or it doesn't actually reflect the real thing, I think we don't have to, that's not something that has to be in dispute. We can all agree that communism, specifically in the 20th century, refers to a phenomena that begins with the Soviet Union, continuing through countries like China, other countries in the world outside of Europe and America, and the Eastern Bloc, and so on, as well as the legacy of capital C communist movements within the United States and Western Europe, and so on. So I think there's no dispute about the fact that communism does have to refer to the thing that actually propped the name into relevance and significance in the first place. And to me, when you begin from there, you have to have a very honest and sober assessment of the record and the facts at hand. Now, the experience of communism was obviously very bloody. It was obviously something that was fraught with catastrophes, to say the least, economic catastrophes, famines, moments of political terror, and so on and so on. But we should have a more broader investigation and criticism of whether this is specifically because of communism rather than a feature of modernity as such, because the modernization of, let's say, even the Western capitalist countries and the world at large fits the same pattern that we saw, if not far worse, actually, I would argue, in the case of communism. The prerequisites to the agricultural and industrial modernization of the non-communist world required in an immense level of famines, social instability, terror, unrest, colonialism, slavery, and so on in the New World, genocide. These are all things that aren't that can't be brushed to the side when we're evaluating how modernization takes place historically. So to me, you have to place communism within that context of this question of pre-modern and largely agrarian societies confronting and trying to persevere through this challenge of modernity. And to me, modernity, specifically in the form of agricultural modernization, somehow historically inevitably leads to this kind of chaos and uncertainty in the way food is produced and in the way the foundation of economies, agricultures, is preserved, right? So this is obviously something fraught with several, small mistakes can lead to catastrophic outcomes. But at the very least, we can say that these mistakes were on record, things that communist states learned from after they were made, very quickly, I should add. And when you don't only look at the negatives that are mostly mass publicized as a result of Cold War anti-communist propaganda and elsewhere, you have to also have a fair and sober assessment of the overwhelming achievements of communist parties in leading their respective peoples to a position, a social position far superior to than before, whether in the realm of literacy, acculturation, medicine, access to a bare minimum of a standard of living, a basic dignified means of livelihood, a kind of guarantee of a job, so on and so on. Obviously, this came to a certain limit and crisis in the 1970s, where this primary standard of living was no longer enough to support the wants and desires and aspirations of the peoples in communist states. But nonetheless, I think we can retrace and reevaluate the original significance of communism in order to now address and put into a new light the challenges that we now face today, which our current liberal order seems to be unable to deal with. We're facing a fourth industrial revolution. We're facing an economic transition not dissimilar to the one that communists were addressing, namely the one from pre-modern agrarian societies to industrial societies. Now we're in a situation of industrial societies transitioning into an era of smart cities and, and more internet-based economy and more kind of decentralization. And I think that communism has a newfound significance in this regard. So I think I'll just end it there.
You got it. Thank you very much for that opening statement. Infrared, want to let you know, folks, if it's your first time here at Modern Day Debate, we are thrilled to have you here no matter what walk of life you are from. And we are also thrilled to have here James Hake. Thanks so much for being with us. The floor is all yours for your opening statement as well.
Well, thank you. And thanks to Haas Infrared for coming on as well. Today was my introduction to Haas and Infrared and what they, or he, I think it's they, believe. I think he's a Marxist Leninist communist. What is interesting to me about him is that he does not appear as rabidly anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-man as the typical communists that I think of, that I run into, I don't know, looking around America, like the Democrats, the Black Lives Matter, Antifa people, the mainstream media types. And I saw a video where he said you can be patriotic and nationalist as well as communist. But my take on communism is that it's atheistic at its root. Like, you have to be an atheist to be a good communist, was one quote from a famous communist, I think I've heard, promoting the insane idea of equality, which is not an ideal, nor is it the truth. The serpent told Eve in the Garden of Eden that you can be equal with God, and that's a lie. And feminist communists have sought to be equal with men, and it's just been a big mess since then. Communism seems to be against men and against nature. Around in America, it has sought to render the men unnecessary to the women and to the children. And it does not mind, as he said, famine, abortion, forced vaccination in the name of, against healthy individuals who are not at high risk from diseases that don't threaten them. It's a violation of they don't mind a violation of individuals' rights for the so-called collective, the greater good. It pushes the lie of anger to be angry. The communist unions seek to persuade the angry so-called workers to go up against and subvert the bosses who envisioned, started, built, and led the businesses that gave them the jobs. And the communists sometimes pretend to be friends and want mutual benefit for everyone. And some of them may sincerely feel that way, but in the end, it's a phony thing. The best intentions are the road to hell, as you may know. Communists don't mind lying, stealing, and killing to get their way. Many others do too. Dennis Prager said, words and ideas are more important for the intellectual, which is the same thing as a communist or a liberal, than actions and reality. So it's partly why the straight-talking Nazis are much more maligned than the sweet-talking communists, which the mainstream media is, they pander to, basically. In America, I think we have what I call commie capitalism, because Amazon, Google, Facebook, all of these are in bed with the government. They support Black Lives Matter, Antifa, just destruction of the country. They support the mass immigration that's changing the face of the country and the values of the country. They support the communist shutdowns in the name of the virus that we have that has just destroyed their competition or destroyed the businesses. And just meanwhile, they've made mass profits. And that means more power for them as well as for the government. In America, we're already a socialist country. You don't own your own land or property. You don't have a right to contract for work with workers to pay them just $1 or $2 an hour if they want to work that, be an usher or whatever. We've lost a lot of jobs in that way. You have wealth redistribution, which is really more like ghetto redistribution through progressive tax and social programs and affirmative action and all these things. You have the harsh hand of law, quote unquote law, coming down on innocent capital protesters because the communism seeks to divide and conquer the whites against the people of color, or the people of color really against the whites, and the liberals against the whites. And it's overwhelming the systems in order to destroy them and rebuild them in their image through immigration. You see the border is just being destroyed because they like to destroy and exploit the crisis and then rebuild it in their image. The government and the media are just filled, in my view, with communists, from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to Nikki Haley and even perhaps Greg Abbott over in Texas. I don't see capitalism as the opposite of communism. I see it really as good versus evil. So I see capitalism as just as many communists do, as a stepping stone to communism, because when in capitalism, we start to do well and then we forget God. You know, the saying goes, tough times make strong men make good times make weak men, and then weak men make tough times. And that's when the communists like to strike. So capitalism is supposed to be about freedom, but you can't have freedom, as I think John Adams said, without morality. So it's supposed to be freedom from this degeneracy, but they push pornography and all of that madness to just subvert families. It's about envy. It's about made up words and false ideals, things like racism and just division. Satan came as the angel of light, and evil is subtle. It sounds good. It's an imitation of logic and morals. So that's communism. Don't fall for it.
You got it. Thank you very much, James, for that opening statement as well. And want to let you know, folks, Modern Day Debate is a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And in fact, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, as we've got many more juicy debates to come. In particular, at the bottom right of your screen, we are excited as Stefan Molyneux and Destiny face off the last week of this month. You don't want to miss it. So hit that subscribe button and that notification bell for reminders. And with that, thank you very much, James and Infrared. The floor is all yours for open discussion.
Sure. I want to be kind of brief. I don't want to ramble too much, but I think in the United States, and this is one of the things Infrared wanted to embark upon to kind of change people's perception, is that here in the United States, I think there's a lot of confusion about what communism meant in other countries and how that would apply here. And I think that for several reasons, there has come to be this kind of confusion in this country that there's this association with communism and the experience of communism in Russia and China and the existing communist states that survive today. And there's this association with that, with the current, the deep state and the democratic establishment and George Soros and the NGOs and the kind of Davos agenda for the Great Reset. There's this association between communism and these things, I think, because in the United States, the Democrats are considered left and the Republicans are considered right. So people just have this idea that communism is just the ultimate logical conclusion of the Democrats' current agenda. But I think when you actually study the experience and history of communism in the proper context, you will find that, for one, there's a historical tension between communism and religion, but that wasn't necessarily because communism is inherently anti-religious or even inherently atheist. It was because the religious establishments that communists were going up against in their respective countries were deeply rotten and corrupt to the core. They defended the interests of the very corrupt ruling class. And, many normal, ordinary religious-minded people could even see that within these very same religious establishments, you had utmost cynicism and hypocrisy. These people that were occupying these roles of religious power didn't actually even believe in it themselves. So there wasn't even really any authentic faith there themselves. And for that reason, communists had taken in the very beginning a negative stance toward religion. But as the experience of communism was able to mature more, especially now, I think a certain understanding has arrived at between communists internationally and religion, which allows for a communism that has room for faith. Not only does it have room for faith, but is actually able to rediscover itself in the history of the world's great faiths. Friedrich Engels, Marx's friend, if you don't know who he is, toward the end of his life, he wrote about how in the early stages of Christianity, you found pretty much a very striking parallel to the socialist and communistic movement in Europe, that the principles and values of Christianity are strikingly similar to those of the communists. I mean, the President Putin of Russia has pointed out that the Code of Communist Builders, which was the Soviet kind of like handbook for the Komsomol youth, he said all of these things are already to be found in the Bible. So around the world, especially in Russia with its Communist Party, and in Latin America and in the Middle East, and I hope in the United States, communism has not only been proven to be perfectly compatible with faith, but they appear to even complement each other, because from the perspective of the world's great religions, we can see the kind of corruption and decadence and inhumanity that capitalism has brought upon the peoples of the world. And the way in which this has to be addressed economically and politically seems to be very much compatible and similar to what the communists are saying, right? Now, in regards to this question of equality, I think there's also confusion here too, because communists never wanted to make everyone absolutely equal, because as Marx, Engels, and Lenin pointed out, people are inherently different. Some people have more skills than others. Some people are smarter. Some people are stronger. And people are different in general. So communists don't have this idea of making everyone equal. We just believe, as far as equality is concerned, no more than what was written in the Declaration of Independence, that we believe that men and women were created equal, right? Which is what the founding fathers of the United States have said. And all that means is that insofar as the government is going to serve the interests of the people, and we're going to have a government by, for, and of the people, it's not going to privilege these special interests like Amazon and Facebook and other monopolies over the ordinary man. This is our government, and should be treated accordingly. People like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and other billionaires are not gods among men. They're not somehow more human than we are. They're not somehow more citizens of this republic than we are. So in that regard, we just, as far as equality is concerned, believe that everyone should have a certain equality before the government, before the law, that allows us to begin with equal opportunity. Now, we're not advocating for an equality of outcomes in life. If you look at communist states like China, you don't find an equality of outcomes between people. And yet countries like China have done a very good job in being able to crack down on monopolies like the ones you're seeing with Amazon and the billionaire class. China is actually an example of a country with a government that isn't able to be infiltrated by the special interests, the corporations, and with their special private agendas that are beyond the interests of the people. So I think we should be clear that communists don't want to completely level society and make it equal. We just want people to be able to have a fighting chance. And that means people don't own land, they don't own homes. We want people to be able to own things, because if people are able to own things in general, they're going to have a solid foundation from which to begin as equals.
Are you an atheist?
My personal relationship to religion, I would say, is complicated, but in certain regards, I think I am an atheist, just in the sense that I don't like making assumptions about what God is and what God wants and who God is. But at the same time, I'm also someone who's motivated by a profound sense of faith, and faith in something that I struggle to call anything but God or a God. But again, because religion has been misused so often in history, I want to be very careful about my own relationship to faith personally.
Where are you from? I'm just curious, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah. My parents are from Lebanon.
Okay. This is a quote from Marx, the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. At root, is it not atheistic?
I wouldn't say so, because I think what Marx and Engels were trying to say in that regard is that communism doesn't mean to replace all of these things with a new religion and a new dogma and a kind of a new tradition. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, because it's very easy to just assume that because you're having this new political movement and phenomena, that it's going to somehow make a new religion and make a new thing like that. And also, I think there's oftentimes a mistranslation as far as the word abolish is concerned in a lot of these texts. So oftentimes the word Aufhebung, which actually means sublate, which means to preserve while at the same time going beyond, is translated into abolish. And abolish means like to wipe out, right? And oftentimes Marx and Engels write about the sublation of things, which is not necessarily incompatible with their preservation in a new form, right? So the way I look at that and the way I would interpret that is that communists don't want to abolish Christianity. They just want to give a new ground for the expression of the authentic Christian faith without the corrupt religious institutions and establishments which deceive the people and trick people in the name of tapping into their real authentic faith, who are just motivated by cynical interests of serving those in power or serving special interests, or just plainly trying to scam people into making money.
I've seen reports that China, for example, as recently as last year, they were clamping down, I think, on Christians as well as some other religions like Falun Gong or something like that, and saying we need Marxism, not religion, not Christianity. And I've just noticed that, for example, Armenians, I've had some Armenian friends and they lived in a former communist country. And because of that, there is a lot of corruption and a lot of cheating and low trust society making business practices with many Armenians because of that culture, that basically where life is not done, life was once done in America with a handshake. You did not have to worry about a man that you shook hands with pulling a fast one on you. Whereas that's not the case in many of these communist countries, because it seems to be that communism does not understand, or else it purposely exploits the weakness and corruption and laziness of human nature, because it has you where you get something that you didn't earn, and you don't appreciate it. You don't properly take ownership of it.
In regards to the situation of religion within China, Christians are not being cracked down on China for their religious faith. Now, there are various cults, among them the Falun Gong, which is a cult. It's not really a historical or traditional religion. The Chinese government will crack down on those, but not simply because of, in the name of uploading Marxism versus religion. Now, Chinese society, you have to keep in mind, has historically not had the same relationship to religion that other societies do. The Chinese society has been mostly secular throughout its thousands of years of history, just in the sense that its way of relating to spirituality and religion, all those kinds of things, are done through the concrete bonds of civil society and statehood. So that's not really an innovation of communism. It's just been true for China's history at large. But otherwise, Christians are free to practice their faith openly and freely within China. And events like the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century within China, which was a Christian religious uprising against the Qing dynasty, was obviously very influential in influencing the eventual communist movement that would come later. So I think there is an interesting relationship to Christianity there. But again, China is not a Christian country. Now, in regards to this cynicism that prevails within Armenia, you have to keep in mind that after the collapse of communism, when the very same forces that conservatives within America are trying to struggle against, basically engaged in the wholesale privatization of the former Soviet countries, and pretty much looted them and destroyed their traditions and trying to destroy their culture and set up all these NGOs and things like that to promote a society that was more in line and more within the interests of the American deep state. Obviously, the situation in the post-communist states has been catastrophic, but this wasn't the fault of communists. It actually was the fault of the same global billionaires and the global capitalist class who are funding NGOs, people like George Soros, people like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefellers and all this kind of people who have they don't only have an agenda for the people of the United States and for this country, which I think to many Americans has been revealed. They had an agenda to completely overthrow the communist states and replace them with liberal democracies. And that has been an absolute disaster for traditions and for culture and for religion, so much so that in countries like Russia, you find the Communist Party to be fundamentally Orthodox Christian at its core. It's allied with the Orthodox Church because both recognize the forces of anti-communism to be a menace to religion within their country. So to me, regarding the promotion of laziness and selfishness, I think you have to keep in mind that in the 20th century, you had this kind of economic equality within communist states, primarily because they were coming from a backwards agrarian society and transitioning into an industrial society. So the goal was just to give people the minimum of just some kind of modernization. Now, when that came into a crisis, communist states responded to that in different ways. But the most successful way a communist state has responded to the issue is the path China took. And obviously, no one can really make the argument that in China, these vices of, a lack of economic entrepreneurship and innovation and, things like that is being promoted. China is a very industrious, hardworking, innovative, competitive society. And this is
lying and cheating.
Sorry?
And lying and cheating. I don't know if that's...
Well, I'm not sure. I think that's a culture of lying and cheating is common to all, market societies or societies that are part of the global capitalist world economy, right? So that's not something that's the fault of communism. I think that's more something that's the fault of the kind of dog-eat-dog world that we live in. But China has seen profound cultural shifts. And specifically within the presidency of Xi Jinping, we're seeing more of a promotion of morality instead of the kind of unfettered economic growth for the sake of economic growth. There's more of a promotion of moral values and kind of cracking down on this kind of cynical dog-eat-dog society.
Just a side note, you mentioned China. So, and you said, you talk about we communists, and you distance yourself from Soros and all the Ford Foundation, who I think of them as communists. You mentioned Xi Jinping. I guess is that the only communist who is a public figure that we would recognize that you would consider a communist?
No, there are several within Latin America. There's people like Pedro Castillo. There's the leader of the Russian Communist Party, Zayuganov. There's other communists throughout Eastern Europe, leaders of communist parties. And you obviously have communist states like Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, and then also Venezuela under the presidency of both Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. So there's many people I would consider socialist or communist.
Anybody in America?
It's a tricky question within America because I think that there has been a big confusion because of the history of the Cold War and the left-right division. Leftists within America and liberals have adopted the communist identity, not because they have any connection to communism globally, but because they just want to kind of spite the right wing, similar to how people adopt the identity of Satanism to spite Christians. But within the United States, we have figures, socialist or left-wing figures that I would consider to be more aligned with the global communist movement, like people like Jimmy Dore, people like Jesse Ventura, figures like Caleb Maupin, who is himself a devout Christian, while at the same time being a socialist and a communist. You have people like, Michael Parenti, and this is a new and growing movement, which I think in the future is going to be much larger than it is now. But for now, unfortunately, the American left is dominated by forces subservient to the billionaire class and to what we would consider the forces of American capitalism.
I think of communism as exploiting the natural fissures between society. I've heard that. For example, race in America, they divide the races. They divide, again, worker from boss or whatever, so-called rich from so-called poor, men from women, just the LGBTIQ madness. I don't see you guys, and I mentioned this at the beginning, I don't see you and the infrared people as being so viciously anti-white, so explicitly anti-Christian anyway. How are you going to get communists to become reasonable?
Well, I think you just have to look at the name. So communism, it comes from this common root of common, right? It's about finding what is in common. And that's why for me, as Americans, if we're going to be communists, we're going to promote communism, we're going to try and promote what is in common between the people. We don't want to divide people or accelerate or promote these current frivolous cultural divisions that are being promoted by the media to distract people from their real enemies. We want the American people to come together, to be reconciled with one another, so as they can focus their attention on their real enemy, which is the current American establishment, the current billionaire class, the current oligarchy, and the current monopolies, especially in our particular, the big tech monopolies, whose power is so unprecedented that if allowed to continue, they may very well lead to the destruction of our republic and of any semblance of democracy. These unaccountable big tech companies, which are seemingly above the law and don't have to answer to anyone, and who aren't even being regulated in any capacity. So we want people to come together. We don't want to keep dividing people along these identities. Now, at the same time, we can recognize that there are racial tensions in this country. There is a historical and ongoing, in my view, injustice committed against America's Black people because they have been denied the post-Civil War right of 40 acres and a mule, right? And that's not, some kind of total economic equalization. It's just the minimum of having a solid foundation with which to build their own community.
I think that's the last thing they need. Sorry to interrupt. I think that's the last thing they need. And sorry to interrupt, but yeah, they've been given and given and given. It's been debilitating.
I don't think they have. I'm not speaking so much of a handout to make them dependent on the U.S. government, which I think the Democrats have played a part in trying in order to secure them as an electorate. What I'm speaking at is some kind of fundamental just ability to own something from which they can build economically, right? And that doesn't take the form of just, being dependent on the government or being dependent on welfare. Actually, if you look at the history of the United States, this ability for Americans to go and get their own land was the foundation of American prosperity and economic prosperity. Yeah. You had the, I forget the specific name of the act in the 1800s, which allowed Americans who were westward to be able to just pretty much, the Homestead Act. Yeah. These things were integral for the prosperity and economic flourishment of the United States. People were able to have their own land, and from there they could proceed and build something. And then later on, you had the Populists and the Farmers Alliance, who were struggling to have some kind of land reform and break up the monopolies and, have the government be able to regulate electricity and things like this, so that monopolists couldn't use it to hurt the little guy and suffocate his chance.
In my view, the commie capitalism has made that harder for people to afford things. I think blacks, just as much as anybody, have the ability to gain wealth in this country, but that ability definitely is limited because of the subsidizing so-called education, and the corruption of education has made people, and the subsidizing of housing and the minimum wage, those along with what you just said, have made things harder for normal people to get along. And they have men and women working, which has only made people able to afford more, but then they just raise the prices. And so men and women feel like they don't really have to, but they feel like they almost have to work, both of them. And then they're separated from their children. It's such a corrupting influence. Has it not been, just one quick question, I know I'm adding things on top. Has it not been the case that communists exploited the divisions and balkanization and all that stuff in order to create a crisis and take power?
No, so I think I'll just answer in order, just two things. The first thing is that I do agree that there are current monopoly impediments to the general Americans' ability to flourish economically. But I don't know if I agree that those things are necessarily the minimum wage and the subsidization of housing and education, although those being enamored in all the bureaucratic red tape and corruption that they are, definitely do need to be improved and made more efficient. I agree. But in general, I think the number one obstacle is actually the big monopolies, whether in the form of, in housing, you have financial institutions like BlackRock that are buying up America's homes en masse. And what you call commie capitalism, I think I would call it, and this is something that people have referred to it in America, as a kind of socialism for the rich. I mean, the mainstream media tells us we live in a free market capitalist society, but clearly you have all of these special grants and favors the government does for the 1% and for the monopolies, right? It gives them subsidies, it gives corporations tax breaks and subsidies the average American doesn't have access to. There's tax loopholes that allow special interests to be able to game the system and basically rig the system. So I do agree, we do have a kind of socialism for the rich. All I'm advocating for as a communist is that we have a socialism for the people instead. And to me, now the second thing about is highlighting the difference. Communists haven't tried to create crisis in order to seize power. They were rather the ones that seized power as a result of crises that no one else was able to overcome. For example, in China, you had the invasion by the Japanese, and communists had a very important part in the War of Liberation and leading the Chinese people against the Japanese imperialists. And the communists were the most effective in being able to rally the Chinese people and unify, actually, the Chinese people rather than divide them to create the People's Republic. It's not really the communists that were dividing people. It was their enemies that were promoting various divisions between them in order for the ruling class of the time to be able to maintain its grip on power. So again, I think the primary goal of communists is to unify people. But when we unify people, you're going to see the establishment, the mainstream media, the special interests, the institutions, the NGOs, the think tanks, all these kinds of universities, they're all going to rally together and try to stop it. So conflict will inevitably be generated, but that's Trump? Not because it's what we want.
What do you think of Trump and Tucker?
Well, here's what I'll say about Trump. I'm obviously not the biggest fan of Trump. I think that he made many mistakes. And I think the primary mistake that Trump ended up making was that he was completely beholden to the Republican establishment. And I don't think Trump really had any independent direction. I mean, the media was labeling him as a fascist and a Nazi. I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't know what Trump's personal ambitions or goals or loyalties were, but I can appreciate the fact that he did kickstart a movement of Americans who were fed up with the system and who were fed up with the establishment, and he gave them a sense of hope. Now, do I believe Trump himself personally is going to be able to make do on the expectations he's given to his movement? I don't necessarily think so. And that's why, as communists, we don't necessarily want to go against the Trump movement and Trump people. We rather want to show them that there's a more effective way to fight this establishment than Trump can. I mean, Trump, for example, I agree, he was very much treated unfairly by the media. He was very much, lied about and so on and so on. But at the same time, I think as communists, we want to propose a more effective and better way of combating the same forces that were demonizing Trump better than Trump himself could, right? And also part of that means making more alliances, right? We want to reach out and make alliances with leaders of the Black community fed up with the establishment. Because believe it or not, the Black community is not, as loyal to the Democrats as the mainstream media is trying to say. There's many Black people who are fed up with the Democratic establishment. Many Latinos are fed up with it, right? So I think we want to reach out and make even more broad alliances with these groups, maybe in ways that the current Trump movement hasn't been too successful in doing.
I've noticed that the communist people who I call communists, the people who commonly think of the Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and I have a broader definition than maybe others. They exploit the anger of the so-called minorities. It seems like with this version of communism that you want to exploit the anger of everybody. You want to not exclude the whites. And it seems ripe for that because whites are getting angry as well at what's going on. They've been demoralized, lack of morals, and they see the injustice explicitly in many cases against them and men too. So I don't know, you might be successful in this.
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is that, to me, the so-called Antifa, at least within the United States, they're very clearly foot soldiers of the Democratic establishment. Now, Black Lives Matter as an official organization received funding from George Soros. We all know that. And obviously, it's very ambiguous and mysterious, to say the least, about what interest exactly they're serving. But all I could pretty much say is that there are legitimate grievances within the Black community, but I think those grievances are being turned against the Democrats themselves. And as for Antifa, I think the so-called Antifa phenomena, they're calling themselves communists and they're waving communist flags, but this isn't because they're actually communists. It's because they're trying to instill fear in conservatives. They're trying to provoke fear in the people, that the so-called deplorables that are against the Democratic establishment. And because most Americans, and this is a result of the Cold War, have fearful attitudes toward communism, these people are trying to exploit that fear and make themselves into a boogeyman, right? Now, as far as the anger and grievances that white people or men are experiencing, I don't necessarily think this is because white people or men are necessarily oppressed, but I think that many working class people happen to be white, happen to be men, many ordinary, regular people. And one of the ways that the establishment is trying to sow division between people is by, trying to, target or, sow racial divisions and make people feel bad or guilty because they're white and promote all this bullshit about how we have to tear down the statues of founding fathers and all this kind of stuff. So I do agree that there's legitimate anger there, but I don't think that we should sow more of the division and more of this tension. I think we should recognize it as an attempt by those in power to divide people, right? And what communists want to do is we want to bring people together because we think that they're being distracted with this infighting from their real enemy. And that real enemy is the American establishment and the monopolies.
I don't know. There is some truth to that, but the enemy is within. It's a good versus evil. And like anybody with anger is going to end up working against their own interests. I don't think that the black community really has legitimate grievances. At least none that they're crying about, none that we hear crying about in the mainstream, at least.
Well, the black people that are being given representation in the mainstream don't necessarily represent the grievances of the black community. I do think the black community has many legitimate grievances.
Can you name one?
Yeah, sure. They don't have enough self-determination and independence. They're ruled by police departments that aren't really connected to the community, much in the same way that rural people in the United States have been, since the 90s and the 2000s especially, ruled by these federal agencies that are completely disconnected with them, right? So
are you aware of the amount of crime that's happening in these communities? And there
sure,
are
I'm
mothers
not denying,
who are begging for more police.
Right, but I'm not denying that there's a reality of crime. I just think it's a vicious cycle in which the economic conditions that are promoting crime, namely from this wholesale robbery and scamming of America's black population by the Democrats specifically, leads to the attempt by the Democrats that seems at least clear to me to target families, right, and make families harder to start. This creates a vicious cycle, which then leads also to a very vicious form of police repression. Now, I do agree that much of the so-called Black Lives Matter protests were not coming from black people, but were coming from actually primarily white leftists who are serving the interests of the Democrats. I think it's because the Democrats have tried to twist the legitimate grievances of America's various minorities and turn them into a way that will serve their own interests, even though the Democrats are the ones who have betrayed and robbed these same people for decades. Now, our solution to that isn't to focus on the anger and aggravate grievances, but find a way that we can come together in order to address our common problems. We don't really want necessarily people to be angry. We just want people to feel powerful enough, to feel brave enough, and to feel bold enough to stand up for what's right and to fight for their own republic, right? To fight for a republic by, for, and of the people. Because this establishment, these corporations, and our deep state is nowhere to be found in our Constitution. It's an overgrowth on our republic that was not intended by our founding fathers and is threatening to devour our republic itself. Now, I want to make a prediction. I'm looking at the media and I'm looking how they're promoting people like Meghan Markle. And it seems to me they're trying to prepare her for some kind of political existence or presence. And I find it a nightmare that it's a possibility that our elites are planning on dismantling our republic and basically installing the British crown to rule us, right? So I think this is something we really have to keep in mind. And it's something, as a communist, I want to get the word out on.
You mentioned fighting for what's right. How are communists to fight for what's right if they have no God, no morals, no absolute standard? They just do it by any means necessary. Is that not a communistic line, or is that just in America? By any means necessary.
Yeah, well, religious faith is not dogma. If we had an absolute standard, it wouldn't be faith. We wouldn't need to have faith. We would be able to have a guarantee. The reason we have faith is we're putting our trust in something we don't necessarily know, right? And I don't think communists, I don't believe the majority of communists are without a God. Even as an atheist for most of my adult life, I have come to see the value and importance of the feeling of God at the very least, right? The presence of God, right? So I don't necessarily, it's not that communists are against God. It's just that we're reluctant to focus too much on it because it can very easily be twisted to serve the opposite. Now, the great religions of the world warn about this. They warn about how people do things in the name of God, say things in the name of God, while in reality serving Satan, right? You yourself pointed out earlier that I forgot exactly what it said, but evil does disguise itself in the form of good. And
Yeah.
as beautiful as I consider the great religions of the world, it's precisely because of how good, true, and beautiful that they are, that evil forces have used them for completely opposite purposes, right? So that explains really historically the reluctance of communists to really get really deep into the religion. But we saw in the Soviet Union how, for example, when the Germans invaded their country, they rediscovered the Russian Orthodox faith, this pure sense of faith, divorced from the institutional corruption of the church, which I think was a more authentic and real form of faith than the one that existed before communism, right? So we have to bear in mind, communism is not incompatible with religion. I think you can even go so far as to say that communists merely want to do good in the world. We don't want to make heaven on earth, but we want to be good people in this world. We don't only want to focus on the afterlife and heaven, because this world does matter. What we do in this world matters. If we didn't believe that, then how could we condemn and recognize the evil of what our elites are doing? We clearly see that this is evil because we know that what happens in this world matters.
I think that everybody sees evil, but they're not good at diagnosing it, nor are they good at coming up with the right solutions for it. They end up creating more evil. It's like an imitation of logic. Because Karl Marx himself said his Marxism cannot be conceived without atheism. And I think it's more than you're letting on. It's more.
Well, here's why. The reason there's confusion around this is because historically, religion had taken the form of philosophy in Marx's time, right? Marx wasn't thinking about religion beyond philosophy. And in the philosophical sense, Marx was an atheist. He did wholeheartedly reject religion. But that's because, in my view, the meaning of religion became perverted by philosophy, and what was once an authentic and material form of faith, right? Just based in feeling and intuition and true faith and conviction, turned into dogma, and it turned into this kind of absolute guarantee that I view is inherently corrupt. But I don't think that you can reduce people's religious feelings to that. I think people's religious feelings is authentic. Marx also agreed it was authentic. Marx called religion the heart of a heartless world. He said religion was the only way people were able to give expression to their authentic humanity, right? Now, whether or not you believe that in building a more human world, religion is going to disappear, we can all agree that there is something fundamentally good about religion. Marx himself was making the point that the problem is not religion. The problem is our current world, and the evils that we associate with religion are a reflection of the evils of our world, right? So it's kind of more of a philosophical issue that shouldn't be taken as face value, because his historical experience shows, and this is especially true in 2021, that in no way is religion incompatible with communism.
Have you noticed that males who are communists have a female version of logic where it's always excuse after excuse? It's not responsibility. Like the solution for the Black community is responsibility. It's not, oh, they have these grievances, the police are not the Black community's problem at all.
Well, here's what
have you noticed that they have like a female mindset? Excuses.
I would just say two things. First thing I want to say is I do consider it an important feature of manhood that we recognize we're not going to insert ourselves in other people's business, right? So I think Black people themselves are best equipped in being able to diagnose their own problems and what those are. Now, I agree that the white left is trying to speak on behalf of them and make excuses or whatever. I agree. They're trying to speak for Black people, right? But regarding this kind of, I guess you're calling it female logic.
Yeah.
I think you don't really find communist men in this country, in the United States, all that much. But that's also because, and this is historically true, and this is actually true in the ex-communist states, the ruling elites, and this is especially true for this more overly socialized and more urban people, right? The students and people who don't really work with their hands, they tend to be more less manly, to say the least. And interestingly, in Eastern European countries, those people are actually the right wingers, and it's the communists who are more conservative and down to earth, and so on and so on. I think this issue, as far as manhood is concerned, it's really, I guess, as a communist, it is embarrassing to see the type of communists that claim to represent what this tradition is. But that's why I'm trying to set a different example, and several others are trying to set a different example, so that communism won't be associated with that anymore. I do agree that the so-called self-proclaimed leftists and communists in America, in the main, the majority of them, especially the ones coming out of these universities and academia, they are fundamentally, morally, spiritually, however you want to put it, bankrupt people. They have no sense of honor. They have no sense of dignity. They have very slimy, tactics. I myself know this firsthand because I've been victim of them, right? I know how dishonest and inhuman and dishonorable these people truly are, right? I know that firsthand. But at the same time, the way I see that is it's the same reason why you see religions being corrupted. Because to me, evil takes the form of good. It disguises itself as good. But I do fundamentally believe that at its core, communism is good. I just think evil people in this country specifically have been corrupting it for completely and wildly different ends.
That's human nature. What religion were you before you became atheist? Out of curiosity.
I came from a Shia Muslim background.
Okay. Last quick question. I think we're running out of time. The Hong Kong protests, my impression is it was communist students fighting against the communist establishment government. What's your take?
The issue with Hong Kong is very complex, but needless to say, as we've noticed in the United States and throughout the world, you have vested interests trying to promote these color revolutions and these fake revolutions to promote all this social unrest. And it's not really, it's not an organic, like spontaneous thing, just like how we saw in the United States with George Soros funding unrest and protests here. These same people were funding the unrest and protests in Hong Kong. Now, a lot of that grievances of people in Hong Kong came from the fact that there's no housing in Hong Kong, right? There's no land for people. It's people can't find affordable housing, and life is getting harder and harder in Hong Kong. And that's also because the communist government doesn't enforce its economic policies in Hong Kong, which are very pro-people policies. So it lets Hong Kong have its own system. And this led to a lot of grievances that, because it was exploited by global forces, was blamed on the Communist Party, right, in Hong Kong. So I think we have to look at Hong Kong, also look at the protests in Russia with Navalny, look at the protests in Belarus, look at the protests in Latin America. We should all look at these in the same lens with which we look at, with the same level of suspicion, a lot of the unrest that happens in this country.
Interesting. That's about all I have for this.
Ready to become a communist, James?
No, his answers for me are, Haz's answers for me are, they muddy the water. They do explain that a lot of this stuff is just evil human nature. But I think that a lot of it is, one cannot tell what actually happened in history. Look at how the media lies about the present day. So we don't know who did what and what the motive was. They lie about Charlottesville. They lie about the mostly peaceful Capitol protests on January 6th. They lie about the Black Lives Matter movement. They even seem to have Haz fooled on the Black community's grievances. So to me, I think it's a who knows, who cares type of thing as far as the history goes. I like to know present day reality, have responsibility, and not throw out God with the bathwater.
Juicy, any last thoughts, Infrared?
I think it was an overall productive, good conversation. I guess I would say with regards to the Black community, I think this is our main point of contention. I would just recommend reaching out and listening to many Black leaders, right? Because these are not people who are co-opted by the Democrats. They're against the Democrats. And I do think they authentically, are leaders of their own community. They have their own specific views, and they're completely demonized by the mainstream media as well. And it's something that they have in common with American conservatives. So I just think that that's important for unity. But, I do overall agree that the media sows unnecessary division. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to make an effort to bridge those divisions, because there are, in my view, at least, based in very real realities.
I like to, yeah. Do you have any? Who would be a Black leader that you think of as a leader?
Well, historically, you have organizations like the Nation of Islam, right?
Oh man.
Yeah, I mean, you have the tradition of Marcus Garvey historically and its successors. You have Malcolm X historically, who famously called the Democrats the wolves in sheep's clothing. So it's a very rich tradition, and there are living people who represent.
I talk with Blacks practically every day on my radio show. Some of them have sense. Some of them agree with me. Many of them agree with me. Many don't. Many have that anger. They've taken on false identities. They think they're Black Hebrew Israelites, or they have embraced the Islam stuff, the Nation of Islam. What do your parents think when you left the Shia Muslim thing?
I think they were okay with it, primarily because, I did have issues with religion growing up, but I've come to a perspective where I have great respect and reverence for all of the world's major religions. And also I acquired, actually, as a communist, a newfound appreciation for Christianity and in particular, right? Because of how closely entwined communism historically has been with Christianity. So to me, I find beauty and truth in all of the world's great religions.
I think it's important that we not get caught up in the identities where you can't just tell people the truth. For example, for the Hake report, I call on my show, I call Blacks out, I call women out, I call the Black Hebrew Israelites out, and they can call in and disagree with me. I call both the rhinos and the Democrats out, the mainstream media. But I think that we should have the freedom of speech to just say our impression, especially whites and men, because and Christians, they're some of the most docile and submissive lately, and fearful and intimidated, falsely intimidated, because, look at what is happening with Kyle Rittenhouse. He's charged with murder over a clear case of self-defense. People don't have justice, and we have lost a sense of justice and freedom here.
I definitely agree that I do believe that Americans' freedom of speech has been curtailed, specifically and especially by the big tech companies. And regardless of who I agree or disagree with, I do think people should be allowed to give authentic expression to what they really do believe and what they really do feel, because regardless of whether I agree with it or not, it's a first step in being able to come to a point of unity and mutual understanding. Yeah. And as I think a good example of this was recently, and let's not get into the details of it because, I'm on Twitch, so yeah, I'm not sure what, but recently with Dave Chappelle's Netflix special, right? And he was trying to just give authentic, expression to what he believed, and he was canceled for it. Now he's having trouble finding ways to get his movie published and stuff. So it's like his stuff published. I mean, so it's really a shame that we've just created this culture of lying and people not even being honest because they're too scared to speak what's on their mind.
One quick other point, you mentioned Black leaders. I think that one of the problems with men is that we have people that we put up as leaders. We should not be doing that. We should be our own leader and then we unite together and work together. And if somebody's going to be a president like a Trump, then that's fine. But he is not put up on a pedestal where he is influencing our thought any more than any other man would be. You can hear the truth from any man, even your enemy.
I agree with that. I do agree that we shouldn't get caught up in, as men, especially as men. And I can't speak for women because I'm not a woman, right? So I can just speak for men because that's what I am. So I'm not assuming that they're different or something, but I'm just, I agree that we shouldn't be relying and putting all of our trust in just other men, right? Part of being a man is being your own man, having your own thoughts, and being able to think for yourself. So I completely agree with that,
I think that's been the part of the problem with the Black community is they've had these people that they've propped up as leaders, and they've made them into heroes. And you see human nature to do that, especially nowadays.
Well,
because
here's the thing: is that I think ultimately I believe that Black people themselves know what's best and know how to best diagnose their own problems, right?
I think that they need our help. We're all human beings, and we all have the freedom of speech, and they can hear the truth from other races. They need to learn to do that, especially whites.
But they
close their minds to whites, and it's not good for them. Well,
I don't know if that's necessarily true because they just have different experiences. They have a different situation. They have different circumstances, right? And oftentimes it's hard for white people to relate to that because they don't share those same experiences and same circumstance.
But they're all nose up against this imaginary problem that's called racism, whereas whites don't have that blind spot. And sometimes it takes somebody from the outside looking in to see through the madness. Well, occasionally someone will wake up.
Well, listen, that also manifests in the form of white people not experiencing this racism, right? So if they haven't experienced it
doesn't exist.
Well, that's, I think, where we would definitely have to disagree. I think racism is a real thing.
If racism is real, then Blacks are the primary offenders.
I don't agree. But one thing I can say is that, to me, as far as I'm concerned, the Democrats are a very racist party and are a big source of what I would consider real white supremacy. I don't think that rural, ordinary Americans are the main culprits of white supremacy. I think it's actually the Democrats and the liberals who are the most effective sources of racism in this country.
Do you think white supremacy is happening in America?
Obviously, yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what America you're looking at.
But I just think ordinary Americans and rural Americans who are white actually have more in common with Black people in terms of, being down to earth people, right, instead of being these stiff, liberals who do epitomize what we would consider white supremacy, right?
That's why Trump was such a uniting force for people with any decency.
Well, in many ways, you could say that liberals were far more white supremacist than Trump because he was more relatable and more down to earth, whereas they are more obsessed with purity and political correctness. And many have pointed out that this is a feature of white supremacy. But regardless, yeah.
Are your parents more conservative or liberal?
They're really not political.
Non-political. Yeah.
You got it. We'll jump into the Q&A. This has been an enjoyable one, to say the least, so we're going to jump into these questions. Want to remind you of a couple of things. One, if you have a question, feel free to fire it into the old live chat. We'll go for about 30 minutes. And also, our guests are linked in the description. So if you want to hear more of James Hake or Infrared, you can, and that includes if you're listening via podcast, because we put all of our guest links in the description box for each podcast episode as well. And so you can find their links there as well. So jumping right into it with this first one from Lin Yen Chin says, debate is useless noise that never resolves anything. It's just prattling for amusement. Men don't do that, but beta males do. God bless you, Lord Good Hair.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Lin Yan Shin.
Next up, Shaggy Boy says, let's go. And Anna Rodriguez says, I love you, Hake.
Nice. Love you too.
Ozian says, you convinced me, Havoc. Is havoc like some sort of slang word? Are they trying to make fun of you, Hake? They say, I'm an atheist, so I must be communist. Sarcasm. Then they say, thanks for convincing me that I am not on your team.
Well, all atheism is not communist, but all communism is atheist.
Juicy. This one coming in from Chris Morlock says, there are almost as many people in China that identify as religious as there are in the U.S., about 120 million. Why is this, James?
Well, there may be, I mean, there's so many people in China for one, but you know, under hard life, I don't know if they are real Christians. It's hard to know. It's hard to know how many real Christians there are in America. So many, as Haas pointed out, so much of the organized religions, it's just filled with phony people. And so I don't know, maybe the tough times are making a Christian movement rise in China, but for sure, they have to suppress themselves. They don't have the freedom of speech. And I've heard of struggle sessions in communist worlds where they try to force people to believe things that aren't true. And if you don't believe it, you go through what Dave Chappelle is going through, or worse, really.
You got it. And this one coming in for Infrared. Kevin Dunn asks, why can communists openly be on all big tech platforms, but NAZIS can't?
Yeah, I think the issue is that there's just not a lot of people who are informed about communism, and the mainstream political establishment hasn't had to deal with, you know, there has been a very clear neo-Nazi phenomenon. There's been, you know, a kind of right-wing, ultra-right movement in the United States. There hasn't really been a communist movement in many, many decades in this country that has posed a threat to the establishment. So I think that pretty much explains the majority of the reason why you don't really see a crackdown on it. It's just because it's not really that it's politically relevant to the U.S. beyond recently becoming a symbol of, you know, the liberal democratic extremists, right? But beyond that, I think it's all related to, you know, politics, I guess.
Have you caught hate for not hating white people enough as a leftist?
I have been accused of being a white supremacist. I've been accused of being a white chauvinist. And this was all because I insisted on the fact that communists have to be patriots. And that doesn't mean you agree with everything your government does or you agree with your government. It means you have a love of your country and its people and your people, right? And for that reason, I have been attacked and called a white supremacist, which is ironic because I'm not sure if I am considered white. It's not something I pay a lot of attention to, but my parents are from Lebanon. I'm from an Arab background. So it's really weird how people are trying to use race against me when
you're white enough to be hated, I guess.
Yeah.
This one coming in from Chris Morlock. For you again, Hake. They say there are 44 million Christians in China. For comparison, there are in total about 18 million, so far less, Chinese people that live in the U.S. How is the People's Republic of China against Christians? It's kind of
look it up.
Question. This one from Chris Morlock says,
America is against Christians, by the way, just FYI. But anyway.
Says, quote, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions, unquote, Karl Marx.
That's nice. It's tough times do make you turn to God sometimes, and that's important. Karl Marx, although he was a blind atheist, was right about that, I guess.
This one coming in from John Kramer says, I'm here to support Hake of the Hake Report. Says, keep speaking the truth, brother. Also, thank you for having this platform. Thanks for your encouragement, John. And as mentioned, Hake, they are here to support you, Hake.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Black Lennon says, question for Jake. I think they mean Hake, but
yeah,
might also be Hank. They say, what do you think of the labor aristocracy? Do you deny it? What's your thoughts?
I have no idea what that is. The labor aristocracy.
By the way, it just made me think we need T and Earl here. But anyway, red-blooded Republican Trumps says, how do you explain? Sorry, I cut your name off there, friend. I know it probably says more than that, but it says red-blooded Republican Trump. ... How do you explain the current failures of communism in America being the American Indian reservations?
I don't know exactly what that's referring to, but I think the failure of the communist movement within the United States, I think, is a theoretical issue. It's the problem is the type of people, intellectuals, who are attracted to communism, are attracted to it because they're antisocial, and I guess they were the losers in life, and they turned to communism for that reason. But I don't know how this relates to the reservation system, but I think that's how to explain the failure of the movement to ever really be able to kick off here.
I think he's pointing out that the American Indians, they get payouts, whether it's from the casino payouts and things like that, and that ends up being debilitating to them. And so they don't end up doing for themselves and working for themselves and taking responsibility. I've known some Indians who got kicked out of their Indian tribe, and that was honestly the best thing for them. They quit being deadbeats. They started working and got their lives together and had families.
Well, I think all I would say to that, I'm not really familiar with the situation of the reservation system, but what I do know about it is an important part of communism is sovereignty. It's being able to have the necessary level of control and self-determination over your community. And as far as the reservation system is concerned, it has been a form of, we all know that there has been various treaties violated, and the way in which Indians, or I don't know if I have to say Native Americans, have been treated by the U.S. government has been very unfair, and they have been, they have not had a good deal, as far as I would put it, if you want to put it in Trumpian terms. So I don't know if it'd be a good example of communism as much, maybe internalized corruption. And yeah.
You seem to have like that same woman's mindset, if you will allow me.
Yeah.
In that you have like this feeling sorry for these different so-called oppressed groups, these minorities, if you will.
Trump
American
talked
Indians.
about how the current U.S. government wasn't a good deal for the American people. The policies
True.
of our government and its industrial policy.
That's true.
American people were getting ripped off. It's not necessarily, making excuses or blaming. It's just pointing out that the Native Americans or so on, they haven't had a good deal, right? They've been, as far as their relation to the U.S. government is concerned, and that should be investigated. But it's a complex issue. But the one thing I will say is that I don't think it's an example of communism. And that's something I can be certain of without knowing much else.
You got it. And this one coming in from Creo Debunk says, Hake, have you heard about cybernetic economy? Any objection to that? And I don't even know can you tell us what it is, Hake, if you know what it is?
I cannot. Cybernetic or kybernetic economy?
They put it with a K, kybernetic. Maybe they meant cybernetic. I don't know.
I don't know. If Haas knows the answers to these questions, he's welcome, but I don't know.
I think it means cybernetic, but I think it's a complex issue. So,
yeah. Did you know that other thing, the labor? He said
that's like a community meme. Just
okay.
the guy I debated before.
Okay.
Yeah.
You got it. And Long Nights YouTube and longtime viewer, good to see you, says, how do we explain the government putting drugs in the street, creating the war on drugs, snatching the father out of the home, then acting like white people know how to solve our problems when you've created them? I think they said Hake at the end, so I think that's for you, Hake.
So I didn't put the drugs in their community. I didn't take the father out of their home. And honestly, the best thing for them, if the government was involved in that, I know the government did bribe them to have the father out of the home. There's a bribe. And I know that they made conditions tough or whatever for, people in general to make a living nowadays or buy property. But the best thing for us and I think this is addressing the communist, that false imitation of logic, that false imitation of manhood, is responsibility. If the black community who surrendered their fathers took responsibility for that, rather than continue to blame the government, which is evil and it is against them and us and everybody, then they would be doing much better. And I think that's why I'm concerned about whites and white anger, and the appeal of this version of communism that's not so anti-white is appealing to that anger, which is the lie that you have a right to be angry and to blame, when you're better off just taking responsibility. And then will have the strength to fight back in the right way, and you'll have the wisdom too.
You got it. Go ahead.
I think black people are taking responsibility, but they're also trying to point out that, they don't want people outside their community to try and force things on them, right? So I think that's part of it, right? It's part of having your own self-determination.
I don't know what you mean by people outside their community forcing things on them.
Well, I think black people know what's best for themselves, right? They know the best answers to their own.
If they did, would they be voting 96, 98% for Democrats?
Well, voter turnout is very low.
I know, but would they be doing that if they did?
I can't speak on behalf of them. I'm not myself black, and I wouldn't.
But you can see.
We've got a fresh one coming in. This one coming in.
Amazing.
Annihilation Prism says, for Hake, Lenin praised Washington's 1776 and Lincoln's anti-slavery crusade in the Civil War as revolutionary in his letter to the American workers. What is your response to that?
It's a red flag. I think there's a lot of melodrama about slavery and this pretense that they make it sound worse than it really was. I think there's much worse evil today. I think the Democrats today are much more evil than the Democrats who own the slaves. And the 1776 thing, it's nice. It's a nice sentiment. I get that they want to latch on and support the revolution, but I think our revolution, as far as my impression, was more righteous and based in God and nature and nature's God, right? Whereas the communists are atheist.
You got it. And that is it for questions. We do want to say, folks, our guests are linked in the description. We really do appreciate these guys. The debaters are the lifeblood of the channel, so you can find their links.
Well, and I think, come on, we can't. Most Americans understand that slavery is probably the biggest historical evil in this country. Look, we can't say, you understand slavery is a great historical evil, right?
I don't know. There were decent and indecent slave owners. And it's not ideal. It's not ideal to have slavery, but it's not ideal what we have today. And we have actual mass killings of babies in the womb.
I think on this point, that's just a red line that I don't think I could ever come to an agreement with you. I think that is way beyond the realm of conceivability for just normal Americans. Slavery its evil was so unprecedented in the history of humanity that
Are you serious?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And
man.
Yeah, that is
it was a reality of all of history.
No, the slavery that existed in the United States was qualitatively different than historical slavery because it was a modern form of slavery where slave owners were able to do whatever they wanted to. There was no we made them Christians. In the past, slavery merely referred to a relation of power that existed before ambiguously, right? In the Islamic world, slaves were able to actually take power, right? So it was an ambiguous thing.
Slaves were castrated in the Islamic world.
That's just coming left field, right? It's just left field to talk about to try and downplay the crimes of American slavery. We fought a civil war to eliminate that evil from the face of this country.
You did not.
Millions died in that war. And I think it is fundamentally anti-patriotic to try and downplay the historical evil of slavery.
Well,
In addition,
part of that is an attack on the South. The beautiful South is more Christian, more down to earth, more decent, honestly, to the Black community than anybody else in America.
Look, regardless of the South today, we did fight a civil war to eliminate slavery, and to downplay the historical evil of slavery is a form of treason, in my view, against the very basis of this country. Right?
Well, honestly, they were not treasonous when they fought against the North. They had legitimate grievances.
We don't have time to get into a debate about the question of the Civil War, but I do find it extremely appalling and inhuman to speak about slavery in this way. You know, because you will never be able to come to a common understanding or a common point of unity with the various different peoples in this country if you try to downplay the historical evils and injustices.
I'm telling the reality of it.
The Black community. No, I don't even think you adequately represent the Trump's own movement when you say this. I think even Trump's movement can admit the extreme historical evil that is slavery, and to stoop to such a low level so as to try and downplay that and insult the Black people and citizens of this country, I think that is fundamentally appalling.
Blacks should be grateful to be in this country. They should be grateful for that by way of slavery.
No, that's just what you're saying is just a bunch of nonsense.
What you're saying is nonsense. What you're saying is keeping them angry.
Nonsense right now. Black people fundamentally played an instrumental part in building this country. You're talking about they should be great. That's complete nonsense.
They should be grateful.
Should
they not be grateful to be here now?
You're speaking a bunch of nonsense right now.
This is communism.
And by saying this, you're serving the current establishment because you're trying to sow unneeded and unnecessary racial division by saying
this is reality.
So anti-human and inhumane.
No, you people support abortion. Give me a break.
We're not talking about abortion right now. We're talking
that's much worse. That's much worse, and it's happening today.
We are talking about the fact
it's happening
that
today.
Your insult against the Black people of this country.
You're the one insulting them. You're treating them like children.
Incompatible with any pretense that you want to see past the divisions and get to a point of unity.
You're treating Blacks like children. You should be ashamed of yourself. It's pathetic. You think like a female. You're treating the Blacks.
Okay, you're speaking about thinking like a female,
like a woman.
I can't think of anything more fucking cowardly than trying to downplay the historical evil of slavery. It's either that you're ignorant and you don't understand
that's just melodrama.
Or you are being deliberately malicious.
No, you have to use the misery. You have to use the anger. You have to use the false anger about something long past in order to prop up your communism.
You are saying unspeakably evil things. If someone was advocating in favor of pedophilia, would you not be angry?
It's long over.
What if someone was defending pedophilia? Wouldn't that make you a little bit angry?
They do it all the time.
Okay, but human beings should be angry when people say unspeakably evil.
No, you fight evil.
Yeah,
you fight evil, but you don't be angry.
That is fundamentally an evil thing you're saying.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Slavery was one of the greatest historical evils in the history of humanity.
How so?
Because it was the modern form of slavery. It's literally in the name. People were reduced to objects. They didn't even have the minimal status of being recognized as human beings.
I understand. It's not ideal.
And the devastation that this has caused to the Black community and the scars of this evil to this very day.
Not true. That's a lie. That's a lie.
Absolutely.
Nope. The only scars are the anger that you keep
issues facing the Black family. Yeah. What event in history could be more catastrophic for building the foundation of a family than something like slavery?
Slavery, they had their families more than today. And they had their families after slavery more than today. It was the 60s, the 70s.
Right now,
that's real. Look it up.
And infamous cruelty of the
slave you're ignorant
owners.
Right here.
Listen, we fought a civil war to eliminate this evil.
You did
forever.
not. Stop saying we.
We did. I am an American. I was born in this country. I'm just as much of an American as you are. And I am an American
anti-American.
Citizen. So yes,
you're feeling sorry for the Blacks.
We did fight that.
You're feeling sorry for people long dead.
I am not feeling sorry.
Yes, you are.
Fulfilling my patriotic duty of honoring the tradition and history of this country to fight and eliminate from the face of the earth the widely recognized historical evil of this country. That is all I'm doing.
You didn't even explain how it's evil.
I didn't explain how it's evil that we say all men and women, all men are born equal, and yet some people live in chains and are reduced. They're attempted to reduce to the status of cattle and animals. I think it's self-evident the way
We made them Christians. They were happier.
There is nothing Christian about the institution of slavery. It's a mimicry of the pagan form.
It's irrelevant.
The pagan form of Roman slavery. The leaders of the Confederates were among the debauched, depraved, and decadent elites in history.
Some of them
had
were
nothing to do with Christianity.
They were more honorable than you or me.
Secretly, there you had the elements of paganism and complete anti-Christianity among them. This has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. The most fervent Christians at the time were fighting to free their fellow man from the bondage of slavery. John Brown was fundamentally religious.
A terrorist.
To the core. He was absolutely
an angry
more
terrorist.
Christian.
John Brown was an angry terrorist and a murderer. Is the slavery in Africa?
You call John Brown a terrorist and a murderer. And meanwhile, the Union Army was singing his
This
song.
is communism. By any means necessary. Just anger and lies. And murder.
Listen, human beings have the right to be angry about fundamentally unjust things.
Not true.
Yeah.
No, they don't have the right to be angry. Were the blacks enslaved in Africa?
Do.
Is that evil?
They absolutely do. And you are playing into the tropes of the media that all conservatives are racist, which I do not fundamentally believe. Because
you think I'm racist?
I think it is fundamentally racist to try and downplay the historical evil of slavery, and you are particularly insulting the black community
to
such an extent that no possible inroads or alliance or reaching out is possible between you and the black community.
Blacks calling into my show every day agreeing with me. They're not as soft-hearted as you think.
If you were to say that slavery was not that bad, I do not think you would have people believe.
Why do you need it to be so bad?
It's not that I need it to be bad. It is a matter of historical record that it was a fundamental evil. It's inscribed into the very basis of our country as from the Civil War. The Civil War wasn't for nothing.
In order to ignore the present day evils that we have going on right now. It's insane.
Listen, you
Look at the
honestly
spiritual
sound
evil.
more like a Democrat right now than anything else. For you to apologize for slavery, the Democrats also
you mean
did
defending it?
at the time, is just fundamentally appalling and revolting.
Are Democrats not worse today than during slavery? Therefore, killing the babies in the womb?
Listen, there is no need to lie about the historical record and change things to such an extent in this way.
If anything, are you kidding me? Have you seen the people making a melodrama about slavery? Every slavery movie, the 1619 Project, just outright lies.
Yeah,
about
and
how
the way you
break.
combat the lies of the 1619 Project is not to deny the historical evil of slavery, but to recognize that it was the intention of the founding fathers from the outset to eliminate this evil, and the Civil War was the manifestation of this inevitable historical mission. A historical mission I would call a holy mission even.
I think that it's just as you can't recognize good, you can't properly recognize evil. So I think
we are not going to be.
I think you're getting emotional about it.
We are not going to be able to agree upon this.
No, I know. I understand that.
Whatsoever.
But your argument is emotional.
Well,
Truly.
it's not simply emotional.
And communism is slavery.
Listen, you have said something fundamentally appalling and anti-human. That's all I can say.
No, it's not abortion is anti-human, and the Democrats today support it.
There is no need to
address that. Address abortion.
No need to insult an entire group of people by trying to downplay the historical evil of slavery.
They don't. The last thing they need is people feeling sorry for them and pretending that it was so bad.
They did not even
experience it.
I don't think American conservatives agree with you. We're talking about normal baseline.
And that's why they lose.
No.
That's why American conservatives are losing.
You are beyond the threshold of sanity.
No, man.
We've got a few more questions that just came in. This one from Chris Morlock says, how can James Hake claim to be a Christian when he cannot see evil is slavery?
because slavery is not inherently evil. It's not ideal. You don't want it. If you can get your freedom, you should do so. I suppose I'm happy. I don't know if I'm happy about the way it went down. I hear a lot of things about that stuff, but evil is real, and evil is more subtle than these people realize.
Long Night's YouTube and says, as a black man, thank you, infrared.
Simp.
Shaggy Boy says, y'all read Streamlabs? We don't have Streamlabs. It kept crashing on us. Amazing. But Base Stalin, it says, Hake, how is an economic system that encourages greed and envy more Christian than one that promotes equality and helping your fellow man?
That's what communism is. It's based on envy. It's based on covetousness. It's based on jealousy and anger and a false sense of justice, that playing God when you're not God and you think like a woman. How does it feel to think like a woman?
I told you that's going to get us in trouble with.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, my bad. How does it think?
Stalinist says, Hank, how? We got that one. Chris Morlock says, Hake, does the Bible not say in Exodus 21:16, quote, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death?
I think that was talking about fellow Israelites. The Black Hebrew Israelites themselves, whom I talk to, they're pro-slavery. They just don't want to enslave one another.
Gotcha. I think there might be one more. This one coming in from Hitch Wagster says, Haas, aren't you framing slavery as a past evil and ignoring all the slavery that we still have today?
No, my position is crystal clear. All I am doing is doing the baseline recognition that slavery was an utmost historical evil that should not be apologized for, downplayed, or there should be no revisionism of this fact. We should recognize this baseline fact. We fought a war that tore this country apart on the basis of the recognition of this fact. It's as simple as that.
In Islamic countries, they were castrated. In African countries, they're enslaved to this day. I don't think that. I think you're downplaying the worldwide evil and upplaying the evil of
I'm not
America.
downplaying any instance or evil of slavery whatsoever, but I'm just recognizing the qualitatively distinct and distinctly evil nature of slavery on the American continent, specifically leading up to the Civil War.
How old are you?
25.
Yeah, see, that's why you're brainwashed in this way. I'm 40. When I was in school, we learned that there were good and bad slave owners.
Listen, I think
that's just common sense.
Fundamentally
common sense says so.
This view is fundamentally incompatible
with communism.
This is like saying there can be a good and bad rapist.
There's nothing about slavery that's rape.
Yes, there certainly is, actually.
Nope,
yes, there is.
Nope.
Actually, there fundamentally is, and it's a matter of historical record and widely documented.
I recognize that there may have been rapes that took place, but that's rape. Rape is wrong. Slavery is not ideal.
And the two were fundamentally intertwined with one and another.
You're making that claim, but again, there were
it's a matter of historical fact.
So every slave owner committed a rape against every slave.
Listen, the two were fundamentally intertwined as a phenomenon.
You're making it
okay.
Clear
We
as
are
mud.
speaking nonsense. Let's continue to move on.
Clear as mud, just muddying the waters.
This question coming in from Steve, who says, I could be wrong, maybe I misheard him, but did James Hake say that slaves were, quote, treated well?
They were treated well. Many were treated well. They were raised Christian. Some were even taught to read, which reading was not widespread even among whites. So overall, we treated them quite well compared to many other cultures.
This one coming in from Adam Albilia. Good to see you, longtime viewer. Says, Infrared, it seems like what Hake is trying to say is that, quote, you haven't demonstrated how enslaving people is evil.
Yep.
I think it's a self-evident and absurd, it's the reason why is just self-evident. If we have to get to a point where we have to debate about why slavery is fundamentally evil, then everything else becomes up to debate too, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to arrive at a situation where we have to start debating about things like pedophilia and things we know intuitively and inherently to be wrong.
God is self-evident, but you're relying on your feelings. You're lost about that.
Like I said, there are lines we should not cross as human beings, as a matter of basic human decency and humanity.
Sorry.
Freedom
This
of
one coming in
speech.
from Hakeem says, Hake, how do you react to the British deep state's attempt to assassinate Lincoln by supporting unpatriotic John Wilkes Booth and the Confederacy? Also, shout out to Infrared and RTSG.
I don't know much about that, but it sounds like it was evil fighting against maybe evil. I don't know whether Abraham Lincoln was good or evil, because you can't trust any history nowadays, much less the mainstream media present day.
You got it. And with that, do want to remind you our guests are linked to the description, folks. It has been a lively one to be sure. And we are excited for this other lively one that I had mentioned earlier in the stream, as we have confirmed it just a couple weeks ago. Destiny and Stefan Molyneux in the last week of this month. You don't want to miss it. That's going to be a juicy one. So hit that subscribe button. And want to say thanks again, James Hake, as well as Infrared. It has been a juicy one to say the least.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate that.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. And I'll be back in a moment, folks, to give you updates on upcoming debates. So stick around for that.